Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Martha Tatarnic as a guest. Martha is the lead priest of St. George's, a thriving downtown Anglican church in St. Catharines, Ontario. Martha writes a regular blog for the Anglican Church of Canada, which can be found at medium.com. She's the author of The Living Diet, a Christian journey to joyful eating, an exploration of our relationship with food and our body through a Christian perspective, and also her second book, Why Gather? The Hope and Promise of the Church, which we'll be talking about today. You can find out more about her at marthatatarnic.ca. All right, welcome to the show, Martha Tatarnic. Thanks so much for being here. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Lauren. I think it's worth noting that I've now been in parish leadership, church leadership for a little over 20 years. I was kind of a kid when I first got into ministry, and it's still kind of a surprise to find that this is what I'm doing with my life. You know, people often ask what it was that made me want to get into parish ministry, and my answer is I didn't want to be in church leadership at all. I was going to be a lawyer, but it's certainly been a wild ride and a wonderful learning curve over the past 2 decades.
Yeah, awesome. I should add for our listeners, Martha comes to us from north of the border, again, coming from my context in the States. So welcome to hopefully some Canadian listeners. But thanks so much for being here. Share, if you would, kind of about your journey of faith, what that looked like, perhaps in the beginning, what that looks like today.
Yeah. I grew up in a church-going family. My family settled in the Anglican Church, which the Episcopalian Church would be the corollary to that in the U.S. We settled there when I was probably 8 years old or so on, about that age. It just seemed to be a home for my family in terms of intellectual freedom and the sacramentality, the symbolism, the ritual that sort of connected with our artsy-fartsy souls. And I was around the age of 15 when I'd been going to church my whole life. I'd always been interested in questions of faith. I had always felt like God was a real and guiding presence in my life. I was always intrigued by Jesus. But it was around the time of that I was 15 that I started to really feel connected to the worship life of the church, and really invested in reading the scriptures as well. And it was those components that suddenly made the life of the church feel like it was essential to me, rather than just something that I did to make my mom happy. And also the other piece that connected in with that coming together of those pieces was that realization that I thought I was being called actually to be a church leader, to be a priest. So I studied music in undergrad, but with the intention of going to seminary. I was ordained when I was 25, and I've been leading various churches of various sizes and contexts for the past 20 years.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. 20 years in ministry is no small feat.
No, yeah, that's true.
What are some spiritual practices that you've developed, found meaningful, might recommend others?
Well, I mean, I could give a long list here, but I'll just talk about something that is meaningful to me right at this very moment, which is to be part of the daily office in the life of our church. So we have a new associate here at the church who has just started opening up the doors of the church building weekday mornings and gathering people to pray the morning office, the kind of set prayers of the wider church. It takes about 15 minutes. I was reflecting with him this morning that, that was a piece of my prayer life that was really important to me when I was younger and before I had children. And it just really kind of fell by the wayside after I had kids. I couldn't imagine getting up in the morning and doing anything other than hitting the ground running.
Right.
But somehow that gathering of even just a few people at a regular time, that gift of community, allows me to get back into that habit in a way that I'm finding very centering and life-giving. But it doesn't feel like something I'm capable of doing on my own right now. So it's sort of another way in which I'm feeling really grateful for the communal aspect of our faith.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I want to ask you, if I can, just right off the top, we're going to talk about her book, Why Gather? The Hope and Promise of the Church. Recommend the book, but I kind of want to ask you right off the top. You just mentioned 20 years in ministry. I'm reading another book. There's so much conversation right now about clergy quiet quitting, and obviously the clergy burnout with COVID and so much political strife in the United States. I don't know if you're willing to share kind of what's kept you kind of grounded, kept you sane in the midst of just reading your book. It sounds like you've been through some struggles. What's kept you in it?
Yeah, it's the people who share the walk with me, for sure. And yes, I do talk in the book about skating on the thin ice of burnout, and sort of not realizing how thin the ice was until it was almost too late.
Wow.
So, I've definitely had my moments of frustration and exhaustion with ministry. At the same time, I count myself incredibly fortunate because most of my ministry time actually has been happy. I have had a very happy 20 years by and large. And I think that the number one reason for that is I have been so blessed with always working as part of a team. I've never had to be a lone wolf in ministry.
Yeah.
Even in smaller parishes where I've served, there has very much been a sense of there's this ministry team at the heart of what the church is doing, and I'm not just trying to figure this all out by myself. So that has been kind of the number one thing. And I think it's something that we really have to be very conscientious of as we sort of look at what restructuring needs to be in this next chapter of the church, how we can set people up for the success of not having to be a jack of all trades in ministry.
Yeah. I was thinking about that just recently here, that how much, I think the statistic is right that coming out of seminary, people tend to burn out in their first 5 years, leave the profession, right? And I wonder, like, what difference it would make if people could, I think, at least in the last probably 10, 15 years in the States, at least, and I imagine it's probably similar in your context, right? Where because as they're smaller churches, there's not like the opportunity as much for someone to come out of seminary and work as an associate or as an assistant pastor or clergy person. And they come into these small churches or parishes and they kind of have the jack of all trade thing, like you said, and quickly find themselves doing like all these minutia tasks that, they're like, hey, I didn't come in a seminary to like, recruit volunteers or clean the toilets or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, do you think that's a real challenge that's part of the problem?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I like the two cohorts before me in terms of ordination in this particular part of the church. I think everyone in that cohort left ministry in the first 5 years. And
wow.
And yeah, I think that piece around kind of getting thrown into situations that you're really not trained for is part of it. I think I think the church has been hit or miss in terms of how intentionally we think about curacies. So curacies in our tradition is that first couple of years where you are ordained, but you're also working in a team context with a senior pastor. And I think that's a big reason why I've been happy in ministry, is because I had such an excellent curacy experience that, extended in friendship and mentorship so far beyond those first 2 years. I really felt like I was set up to learn and grow rather than set up to fail.
Yeah. Spell that word for me.
Curacy. So there would be, I guess, different language and different traditions, but that's the language that we have in the Anglican Church. And when there are resources to make that happen, it sure makes a big difference.
Yeah. Well, this is good. Thanks for just kind of engaging with me on that.
Yeah, of course.
With this on the fly. Again, I'll reintroduce you. The book is Why Gather, The Hope and Promise of the Church. Martha, share, if you would, kind of what inspired the book and how it came to be, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that there are really 3 threads that coalesced into the idea for the book and run throughout the book. And those 3 threads would be, first of all, what it is to be formed by a church in decline. Because I have zero experience of anything other than a declining church structure. I've served in churches that have had growth and vitality for sure, but the institutional church in my living memory has always been in decline. And I have always been I have always lived in a world that feels very secular. When I was in high school and discerning a call to ministry, like none of my friends were churchgoers. Like the assumption of my life is mostly that church is something that most people opt out of in our world. So ministering in a declining church was kind of the first thread, like what the response of an institution that seems to be fighting for its own survival takes, what that response looks like, and what burden that places on leaders. Which brings me to the second thread of the book, which is that coming to a place of feeling like I was very close to burnout. And that was happening to me pre-pandemic. I was just starting to feel like I was I'd been juggling so many balls for so long in terms of continuing the traditions of the church and trying new things and new initiatives as well. And suddenly none of it seemed to be working any longer. And that burden felt really heavy on me. And then the third thread is that just as I was beginning to really have to acknowledge what was happening to me personally, the world shut down with COVID-19. And suddenly everything about our patterns and our juggling acts completely changed. So those were the three pieces that all came together, in March of 2020. And the book is a reflection of wrestling with those threads.
Yeah. Now, one of the themes, at least as I understood it, that really carried throughout the book is this metaphor of ultrarealism as your experience in running. So, we talked a little bit about our appreciation for running before we started recording. Share, if you would, kind of what ultrarealism is, maybe how it fits in the running, and how you see it fitting in the church context.
Yeah. So over the years, I have really gotten into long distance running. I ran my first marathon in 2021, but I'd been really enjoying running half marathons before that time. I'm not a natural athlete, so it's pretty funny to find myself not only as a runner, but a long distance runner and an enthusiastic long distance runner. These are things I never really saw for myself. The term ultrarealism I came across as I was training for that first marathon. And it's a mental fitness perspective described for endurance sports. So the premise of ultrarealism is that in endurance sports, we can so easily get derailed, not by the physical challenges, but by the mental challenges of what we're trying to do. And I would say the two big traps of mental fitness in endurance sports is, number one, wishing that things were different from what they are. Yeah. And number two, worrying about what is coming next. So, when you start out on a long run, it's really easy to feel discouraged by the wind or the rain or the temperature or, by the fact that you've only run 1 kilometer and it felt really hard and you have 29 to go. Yeah. And how am I going to get through the next 29? And you can just freak yourself right out of doing anything other than that 1 kilometer because you feel like the whole thing just stretches before you in a way that feels impossible. But ultrarealism is to focus your mind away from the wishing and the worrying and to become really attentive to what's actually happening and to make your decisions based on what is actually happening, to accept what's happening and then to embrace it. And that has a lot to do with being clear about what is out of our control and how we're empowered in the midst of all the things that we don't control. So that metaphor for running, I find enormously helpful as a runner, but I find it enormously helpful as a human being, just trying to navigate life, because I think it's pretty easy to see how wishing and worrying can derail a lot of situations other than endurance sports. And certainly how much energy a church institution fearful for its own survival can invest in the wishing and worrying instead of attending to what is actually happening, and just getting really clear about, what we can do something about and what we can't.
Yeah.
What's not, what we're not in charge of.
So I think that's such an interesting perspective, because obviously, and I imagine, broadly speaking, some of the same cultural dynamics that are happening in your part of the world in Canada are similar to what's happening here in the States. So much of it is, quote unquote, cultural secularization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we don't need to talk about all those dynamics here. But so there's a line you have in the book that the mainline church is so concerned with its decline, kind of that worrying and wishing, if I'm thinking through it right. All can see it's their own faults and failings, wishing for something to be different, wishing to be something other. So filter kind of that line there through the ultrarealism way of thinking, how churches could do it differently, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of looking back to the good old days and regretting that things aren't as they used to be. I think in the Anglican Church, in the mainline tradition, there's so much of looking to denominations that seem to be way more successful and have, way more young people and tithing young people filling their pews, and to feel like, well, we should be doing what they're doing. Why can't we be more like them? I liken, in my book, the mainline church to having a problem with body image. Like, I know that I wouldn't know how to be a follower of Jesus if it weren't for the intellectual freedom, the commitment to equality and inclusion, the richness of the symbols and the sacraments of our tradition. All of those pieces help me to be a follower of Jesus and help so many people to be a follower of Jesus. But we can't even kind of see and embrace the beautiful things about our part of the Christian tradition, because we're so kind of consumed with what we don't have, or what we think others are doing better, or what we feel like we've lost.
Yeah. Kind of to that point, or on that theme, you also write, mainline church has gotten trapped trying to save something other than who we really are. So I think you've kind of hinted at there in your previous answer, but what are we? Speaking big, universal we here, and then what should we mainliners be trying to save?
Yeah, we're doing a study on it in our church right now on the book that I wrote, and just gathering people to talk about it. And so I posed this question to them this past Tuesday, and their answers were just like really clear and really immediate, that, at its heart, the church is always about a relationship with God, and for us as Christians, that relationship with God is through following Jesus. That's, always the heart of it. And out of that is a life of service and a community of prayer and fellowship and friendship. And those pieces of prayer and gathering and service, and people who have been met and changed by the living God, like that's that's what this is.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to your podcast from a couple of weeks ago with Ryan Panzer talking about, all of the online manifestations of Christian community. And I just thought it was so interesting the way that he named that, there's more that's the same about this like new chapter of the church than different. Like it's the core doesn't change, even if kind of the ways in which we support and embrace and live out that core adapt and change. I think, again, for the mainline church, we put a lot of emphasis and worry into saving the institution.
Right.
And I'm not anti-institution. Like, I think the institution can do brave and bold things in terms of supporting those pieces of service and prayer and community. But we can't get confused about which is which. Like, we're not, like, the thing itself isn't the institution. The institution needs to adapt and be structured in a way to support that relationship and how it gets lived out in service and community.
Yeah, I think the thing itself is not the institution. Perhaps some leaders might need to hear that sometimes, but that's another conversation.
I mean, I need to hear it too. Like,
sure,
I'm somebody who makes my living through the institutional church. Right. So I say that as much for myself as for anybody. I'm not on any high horse here.
Yeah. So one of the things that really resonated with me about this metaphor of ultrarealism and the church, as someone who's worked in mainline context for several years at least, is, I think, from my perspective at least, there can be this kind of like, I don't know, kind of like this false, almost magical thinking of like, oh, if we just talk about abundance and generosity enough, like we can like gloss over the fact that like our budgets are like massively in the red. We're bleeding people, buildings are falling apart. But you say that ultrarealism isn't about giving up either. It's about starting with a truth that can be transformational. So how can the truth be transformational in a good way?
Well, I think for me, what I find most empowering and freeing is in being really clear about what I'm not in charge of.
And
like what I'm not in charge of is God at work in people's lives. Like, that is happening. God is like, God's on it. Like, God is at work in the lives of my parishioners. God is at work in the life of my community. God is at work in the life of the world. I don't need to make that happen. I don't need to program it into happening. I don't need to, I don't need to make God show up. What I can do, and, I talk about my life as a priest is fundamentally my job description is to lift up, to lift up the voices and the perspectives and the stories, the offerings that help us to more clearly see what's already happening. Again, like, I'm somebody, I'm not on any high horse. I can feel like the weight of the world rests on my shoulders as a parish priest. I can easily get confused into thinking that I'm sort of in charge of making everything happen. But coming back to that like ultra real perspective of here are all of the things that I can't do anything about, and B, I'm not in charge of.
Yeah.
Just helps to really clarify then what I do, because when you're clear about what you're not in charge of and what you can't control, then you can make some pretty fruitful choices about, what you are going to do and what you can do.
Mm-hmm. So if I can ask, like, I'm thinking about this again as, and I don't do many long runs these days, but I can certainly remember back when I was training for a marathon, you go out and, like, for, again, American context, first mile or two, you're just like, oh, this is awful.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh boy, I got another 16 to go here, 15 to go. So for me, it was just like thinking back then, it's just like, you know what? I'm just going to keep putting one foot in front of the other here. I'm feeling awful, but I'm just going to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Then, before I knew it, I was done, type thing.
Yeah.
Like, what are some things, like, give me some real practical things, example here, like, that looks like in a church context for a clergy person.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right about the running. Most of the time when you sort of actually focus on what's happening right now, like right now I'm running.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's whether I'm wishing or worrying, right now I'm running. I think the parallel in church ministry is, like, right here and right now is a gathering of people who have incredible stories about how their lives have been transformed by God, by prayer, by the life of the church, how, they have experienced grief and brokenness and sin and loss, and how they have found in their Christian faith the redeeming of that pain and heartbreak into, some kind of offering, some kind of, like, beautiful offering of love. And they're living this out in just, like, profound and inspiring ways. And again, even in our mainline context where we're supposedly not great at sharing our faith stories, or we're not kind of as vocal about talking about our relationship with God, if you just, like, kind of invite people and, like, scratch beneath the surface a little bit, like, just kind of ask people to talk about it, it pours out of them. So, one piece that I think we've been really intentional about developing in my church here, and that I think has been enormously fruitful, is to create those kinds of opportunities, whether it's through preaching series that involve a lot of different people in the church, whether it's through, small group studies, those opportunities for people to just be invited to talk about that. It's amazing how that just starts to change the culture of a church, and suddenly everybody's a little bit more tuned in to how they see God working in their lives, and how they see God working in the life of the community, and it's contagious in a way, because the truth is that, like, God isn't just at work in the lives of the people in our church. God is at work in the lives of everybody in the world. And I think in so many ways, there's almost an unarticulated desire to put some language to that, to those, like, uncommon experiences of miracle and prayer and redemption and, all of those pieces.
Yeah. So I want to ask, perhaps, if I read correctly, you write that there's a big risk in an ultra-real church. Talk about what that risk can be.
So, at a clergy conference a couple of months ago, a group of us were talking over drinks in the evening, and we were kind of talking through some of our frustrations with the way in which the church can really fall down in some significant ways, whether it's in how we respond to the decolonization, the need to address racism, whether it's responding to sexual misconduct in the church or misogyny in the church. And somebody in our little group of, people in this casual conversation kind of said, well, should we really expect any differently? We are just people after all. Are we maybe being too hard on the church in our criticism? And I think that's a temptation at any time, not just in terms of ultra-realism. The temptation is to say, well, we're just human after all. Oh, we're just of course we're flawed. Oh, of course the church is full of people. And, my book doesn't put any rose-colored lenses on the life of the church.
Right.
It makes it very clear that we're full of flaws and mistakes and ways in which we get it wrong. And yes, the church is full of frustrating, misguided people, including ourselves, who lose track of what this is all about. I mean, we all do that, but to accept and embrace that is not to say that we don't also continue to pursue change. That's not good enough. It's not good enough just to say, oh, well, we're just human. Oh, well, we're just flawed. No, we're also people who are, we've been given a glimpse of a vision of the kingdom of God, and we've been tasked with, how the kingdom of God can better be perceived and revealed right here on earth. We do pursue the ways of justice. We do demand change. We do think that how things are, business as usual, isn't the answer. So yeah, I think in getting real about the flaws, I don't want to suggest that we don't also dream big and hope and work for more.
Yeah, I like that. I want to ask you one more question here before we take a break, and I have to leave a few on the chopping table here for sake of time. And this one just came to me. In your book, if I remember, you have a chapter or something where you talk about pushing through pain that, I think if I remember right, caused an injury or was the result or was coming from an injury. And again, I think about this, again, in my experiences in running, sometimes things just hurt, but sometimes you're also injured. Share, if you can, for, again, thinking about this for a clergy person. I think there's sometimes, if I can speak for universally here, I think sometimes clergy get hurt from church contexts or people in the church, but there's sometimes, and we can work through that, and then sometimes we're really, really deeply injured by people in the church, the institution, etc. What thoughts do you have about kind of discerning what is what and working and dealing with such?
Yeah, I thank you for asking, because I thought that was a really important piece to include in the book. And yeah, the story in the book, the metaphor is that, I ran for 28 kilometers on an injured hip, thinking that, like, no pain, no gain.
Right.
Like, if you're training for a new distance, of course it's going to hurt.
Yeah.
And so I just ran through the pain thinking that, well, this is what it is. And then I couldn't run for months because I tore something in my hip by doing that. I think that it's all too easy to adopt a sort of martyr complex in parish leadership, and to think that sacrifice and pain are part of the job, and they certainly are. I mean, sacrifice is part of being a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, like, there's a fine line between that sacrificial offering of our lives that is in fact life-giving and what God is calling us to do, and becoming really injured in trying to do and take on more than we should, or not listening to our bodies, not attending to our own health in the midst of trying to lead and care for people. And, I think that for me, and this, comes up throughout the book, I have needed the voice and the care and the concern and the wisdom of others time and time again to pull me back to that balance of where the sacrifice is in fact a faithful and true response, and where it needs to be measured with some self-care.
Yeah. Well,
and with a willingness to kind of name our own vulnerability and our own inability to kind of do everything alone. And that's why I try to be as honest as possible about my own struggles with burnout and with not being well in ministry, because, I think sometimes we really need to be able to say, I'm not okay. I need help.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your thoughts and sharing about the book. Again, it is Why Gather, the hope and promise of the book. I imagine available wherever most books are sold, yes?
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, let's take a break. We'll come back here with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Martha Tatarnic. And again, thank you so much for your time and for the conversation. These closing questions, I always tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. If you're Pope for a day, what might that day look like for you?
Well, I think I would be really focused on raising up the voices of women in leadership in the church. I think I would just go pedal to the metal on that for the day. I'm not somebody who thinks that, the church is automatically going to be more compassionate and caring and nurturing and maternal just by having women in leadership. But you're missing out on half of a whole world of leaders and voices. And, the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. So let's make sure we're not missing out on half of the laborers.
Yeah. Yeah. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Well, this might sound a little out there, but I would say Anne Boleyn.
Oh.
In the Anglican Church, we're a product of the Reformation in England, which is sort of famously attached to King Henry VIII's desire for a divorce so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. But she's a fascinating figure in and of herself in terms of her own commitment to some of the principles of Reformation, especially around having the Bible published in English and encouraging Bible study amongst people in the court. I think she's pretty underrated in terms of a theological force to be reckoned with in terms of the Reformation coming to England. So I'd love to pick her brains and see what all got missed from the history books there.
That's good. That's a good one. I've not heard that one before. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think we'll be talking for a long time about that experience of COVID shutting down our churches to public worship, and that very first time for any of us in church leadership of coming into an empty sanctuary and maybe a camera and that experience of how empty the church felt and also how not empty the church felt, and kind of the essentials that were revealed in what the communion of saints and the great cloud of witnesses actually is, even when we're not physically together.
Yeah. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
I hope that that we will not shy away from our legitimate offering as a response to some of the greatest crises of our day. And, I talk about that in the book as well. Like, I think so much of the world's problems right now, whether it's climate change or racism or, whatever it is that we're talking about, is about people becoming disconnected from the reality of how biologically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, we actually are to one another, how connected we are to one another. And whatever form our gatherings take, I think that the gathering of the community of faith bears witness to who we really are, to a world that's forgotten, that we're who we really are as relationships, not individuals.
Well, I really appreciate the time and the conversation. Share where people can connect with you online.
All right. Well, I do have a website, marthatatarnic.ca. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. I think I'm the only Martha Tatarnic in the world, or certainly on any social media platform I've found. So as long as you get the spelling of my last name right, you can find me pretty easily on Facebook and Instagram. I write a blog for the Anglican Church of Canada. You can find that on medium.com. And again, by looking up my name.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. I always leave folks with a word of peace. May God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Lauren, and also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.